Okay, so now that we're back, we're going to do part two of the Odyssey introduction. And even though we're not reading the Iliad, you have to understand some basic core components of the Iliad in order to understand exactly what is going on in the Odyssey itself. So the Iliad is about the Battle of Troy, and probably if you know anything about the Battle of Troy or the Trojan War, then you know that it had to do with a girl, and the girl is known as Helen of Troy, but before she was Helen of Troy, she was Helen of Sparta. Helen is in pretty much every version of the myths. She is the daughter of Zeus and Leda. Zeus came to Leda in the form of a swan and raped her, and Helen was then hatched from an egg. In some versions, that Leda had two eggs, and one of them was Helen, and then some sons were from another one. But you don't need to know any of that. You just need to know that that she's the daughter of Zeus, and because of that, she is the most beautiful woman in the world. And so when she was raised, suitors from all over came for her hand in marriage. And Odysseus was even one of the men who showed up, and he was like one of the poorest ones of the lot, even though he was set to be king of Ithaca. He knew that he like had no hope of winning. He was kind of like going because he at the time he was a single man, and that's what he was expected to do. Instead, in many versions of the stories, instead while he's there, he sees Helen's cousin Penelope and likes her so much that he kind of barters for her. And in some versions of the story, he wins her hand in a foot race. But needless to say, the most important thing there is that Menelaus of Sparta was Helen's father's choice. And when I say her father, her earthly father. But there were so many suitors there, and they were so competitive for her hand in marriage that, you know, they thought someone's feelings are going to be hurt. So Odysseus has the idea that all the suitors that are present for Helen's for this choice say that they swear an oath of allegiance to the chosen man, that we all promise, no matter who it is that is chosen, that we will support that man no matter what, and we will support that marriage, and everybody goes along with it. So this is important. You need to remember that. The versions of how Paris and Helen met actually differ. In some cases, Paris and his brother Hector were visiting Menelaus for some sort of treaty. In other versions, he had seen her once before and then went and stole her. But regardless of what version it is, love at first sight. And that in many versions of the story, Helen leaves with Paris willingly. And at this point, she's married to Menelaus, and they even have a daughter named Hermione. In some versions of the story, Paris is blessed and cursed by Aphrodite. That basically there's like a party of the gods, and a golden apple was thrown at three goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, and they all have an argument as to who the golden apple was meant for, because it was meant for the most beautiful goddess of all. Zeus says he doesn't want to make the choice, so he chooses this mortal man, Paris, to make the decision. He chooses Aphrodite. And in many versions of the story, Aphrodite says, you can have any woman you want, and he chooses Helen. In other versions of the story, she gives him Helen. So regardless, when they meet, it's love at first sight. They leave Sparta and go directly to Troy, and thus Helen of Sparta becomes Helen of Troy. She does eventually go back to Menelaus, and we see them in the Odyssey. The Iliad itself, even, like, if you read the Iliad, it doesn't actually even talk about all that, like how she left Menelaus and ended up in Troy. The Iliad actually only focuses on a very small portion of the war, such as the death of Hector. Paris's brother dies at the hands of Achilles, and Achilles is like really, really played up throughout the Iliad. For many, many years, scholars thought that the Trojan War was a myth and that Troy itself was a myth, but in the 1860s, an archaeological discovery found Troy. That doesn't necessarily prove that the war happened, but it really changed the way people viewed the literature, to know that the city itself was real and it was not just contained in myth. And this is something that, Joseph Campbell has always argued for, and many other scholars have argued for, was that all myths have some nugget of truth to them. So, about all those guys who swore the allegiance that Odysseus came up with, they all had to sidle up and help to get Helen back. All those guys who said that they would support Menelaus and support that marriage all joined with him and went to Troy and burned the place to the ground. It was really bad. Odysseus at the time was king of Ithaca. By the time the events happened that called him to war, he had married Penelope and he had had a son named Telemachus. Leaves his infant child, goes to war. He does very well in war, and he's known throughout the events of Troy for his wit and for his strategy, and he was the one behind the most famous image of the Battle of Troy, the Trojan horse. So like I said, the war lasted for 10 years, but then it takes Odysseus another 10 years to get home. And that 10 years leaving Troy is what the events of the Odyssey are focused on. And really, most of the Odyssey is focused on the final leg of his journey. Like when we see him, he's kind of in the final leg, and then through flashbacks, he tells us what all he's been up to. So when you get to the beginning of the Odyssey, take into consideration it's 20 years of him being away from his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. And throughout those 20 years, he's been aided by Athena off and on. She has her hand right into the thick of things, to the point that it's really frustrating, where you think, dang lady, why don't you just take him home? But it does make for really good storytelling, the action, and it's really good. Like I said, if you have read any of the Percy Jackson books, then you're really going to enjoy these, because the Percy Jackson books borrow so much from it, and a lot of it will be very familiar to you. So I look forward to reading this with you. It's one of the longest, it is the longest piece of literature that we read in English Honors 9, but I think it's a really great accomplishment for young readers and young academics to say that they've read it. So I hope you guys like it.